Thank you for joining us. I will now turn it over to Dean Geer to begin the event.
Well, thank you. Making sure I'm not on mute, and I'm not. Well, thank you. As you can see, our other guest, John Meacham, is taking a call, and he will be with us very quickly. But I thought I'd use this opportunity at least to talk about the results as a way to introduce this conversation. You know, it was an intense week for everybody, whether you were supporting the president or supporting the vice president, and now, as people referring to him, as president-elect. Fascinating in lots of different ways. What we want this session to be about is thinking about now governing. We'll talk a little bit about how to interpret the election, which is very tricky undertaking, truthfully. And we'll discuss that a little bit. But let me just kind of let's just talk about where the results stand right now. So votes are still being counted in some states. Josh Clinton, who is a professor here, teaches with John and I and Unji Kim, our elections class. Josh manned the election desk at NBC News, just got home yesterday. And so he had quite a ride, and it was quite interesting. I saw him this morning, and he said that Arizona will likely hold for Biden, but it'll be down to 5,000 votes. That the Fox News call he thought was premature. He said that at the time to me. And certainly given how close it was, while Biden may well carry it and the calls that AP and Fox made will be justified, it's still nip and tuck. As you know, Georgia's 10,000 votes. None of these recounts are going to change anything. Apparently, Georgia law, you just stick the ballots back in the machine and scan them. So it's just not going to change things very much. So at the end of the day, I think we can assume that Biden will be over 300 electoral votes. Obviously, three states have not been called. Nobody thinks North Carolina will be anything but in the Trump camp. I don't see quite how the math has worked. But again, one of the things that is the case is this is very complicated. You have to stick to the data. Again, citing our friend Josh Clinton, on Friday morning, he suddenly became aware that there were 100,000 provisional ballots still out in Pennsylvania, which meant who knows where they would be. And provisional ballots on average have been supporting Trump. So it just threw everything off. It turns out not to have changed anything in any serious way, but you just have to be very careful. And so, you know, when you think about it, what we have is we have one country, but we have 50 states, and then they have different rules. And then often the counties will have different approaches as well. The popular vote looks like it probably will be about 5 percentage points for Biden, which is more than double than what Hillary Clinton received. This was a really close race in a lot of different ways. It was especially close in the Electoral College. If you'd had a 1% shift towards Trump away from Biden, that might have flipped a whole bunch of states to the president. He would have been reelected. So in 2016, he won a series of close states that gave him the presidency. It looks like in 2020, he lost a series of states very closely that will have cost him the presidency. So that's kind of where things stand. It'll be interesting to see how the legal challenges that Trump plans to pursue will play out. Most legal, I'm not a lawyer, but most lawyers that I've talked to know something about this, do not think any of them have much standing. And at what point do Republicans follow the suit of President Bush, for example, and simply congratulate Biden and then move towards governing? We will see. One thing while we're waiting for our friend John Meacham is let's talk a little bit about polls, because polls performed very much like they did in 2016. The national polls look like they weren't too off. If Biden wins by 5 points, I think the Real Clear Politics average was 6.5% lead for Biden on average. So not a huge amount of error there, but certainly some. But again, in the Midwest, there were polls that were suggesting that Biden was going to win Pennsylvania by 8 points, Wisconsin by 10, Michigan by the same amount, and that did not occur. So polling is going to have to figure out what's going on. And of course, in 2018, the polls were roughly right. So what is it that's going on? Is it something about Trump's support? Is it, we just don't know. And so one of the things we have to do is collect all the data and figure that out. One thing I do think is really worth pointing out as we think about these results is to talk a little bit simply about turnout. turnout was just sky high. And that is a good thing for democracy. Whether you like or dislike President Trump, he engaged more citizens than basically any election since probably about 1900. And that's really impressive, and that matters. And so I think we've got to be proud of that. And then the long lines that people were dealing with, waiting in lines for that. Again, it's another testament to the importance of democracy. I can't emphasize that enough. So, what lies ahead? It's not entirely clear at this point in time. It really will depend on how President Trump handles this transition. Let's for the moment assume that these results hold and that President-elect Biden becomes President Biden. What we're facing right now is a transition of power, and these transitions are really quite amazing. If you think back to the 1800 election, it was a bitter battle between Adams and Jefferson. Jefferson was called the Antichrist by Adams supporters as one example of how bitter it was. Yet when that election was called, and it was a very, very close election, very controversial, Jefferson won. And Adams turned over power. And that's an amazing statement. The country was still young. Adams knew that Jefferson was going to take the country in a very different way, and he turned over power. It is an amazing thing that we do in this country, because somebody who's pursuing a set of policies that you don't like, that you don't agree with, is in fact you let them have power. And since 1900, I did a quick count of this just for the record, is that every time we have a transition of power, you can think of it in three different ways. One is what I would call a friendly transition. And what is a friendly transition? It's when Ronald Reagan turns power over to George H.W. Bush. Obviously he's vice president, same party. That's a friendly transition. The second type of transition is a partisan transition. So that George W. Bush is president for 8 years. He turns power over to Barack Obama, who's a Democrat. That's partisan. And then the third kind is what I call hostile. A hostile transition is when Jimmy Carter lost to Ronald Reagan and had to turn power over after one election. And so there are these three kinds. And over the course of American history, since at least 1900, which is a good starting point, about 20% have been friendly transitions, the kind that Bush, HW, Bush 41, if you will, had. 50% have been partisan, half of them have been partisan, and then another third have been hostile. And that level of hostility may in fact be at all-time high, depending on how President Trump handles this. We just don't know how that will be dealt with, because losing a presidential election is particularly hard, particularly difficult, because you pour your heart and soul out into it, and it's something you don't get over very quickly. That is for sure. So we'll see how this transition takes place. There's a lot of speculation. I've gotten a couple emails, people asking really good questions, ranging from what happens if something were to happen to Vice President Biden, as if he were to pass away, how would that happen? There's a lot of scenarios that we can envision, but we just don't know the answers to so many of those different kinds of questions. People will worry about faithless electors. In fact, an alumnus of Vanderbilt, Roy Neal, wrote a book on talking about a case scenario where the electors were faithless and flipped an election from one direction to the other. That's certainly possible. It's possible every time, but it tends to be a handful of electors and not make a difference. And if in fact Biden is over 300, which he could be at 306, that's not likely to make much difference. But there still are lots of different scenarios that could play out. As we think about this election and we want to interpret it, one of the things that I want to point out is that the media will make a whole bunch of claims about what this election means. They will claim that it means something really great for Biden, or that it was really a repudiation of Trump, and they'll have all these interpretations and almost no evidence to back them up. No evidence. Because interpreting elections is particularly tricky. And the reason it is that when you voted for Trump or you voted for Biden, all that vote says is that you like that person more than the other person. It doesn't say that you agreed with their policies. It doesn't even say that you like them absolutely. You might have voted for Biden because you liked him, you didn't like him, but you dislike Trump even more. And so using this vote to interpret elections is tricky, and yet politicians and journalists and academics as well will talk about the mandate of an election. Well, why do we talk about the mandate of an election? Well, that's a concept that's simply outdated. And what I mean by that, it was a concept that was developed by Edmund Burke when he was in the House of Commons. It was developed well over 200 years ago. And when he was running for office, think of this condition. 250 people voted for him. That's all he had. His electorates were very small. The suffrage was very constrained. It was white men with property. 250 people voted for him. And they voted publicly. There was no secret ballot. They came to the center of the town and they discussed their ballots and who they were voting for. Burke knew all those voters. He knew all 250. He knew what they were thinking. And he could actually interpret a mandate from all that rich array of evidence. But now, 74 million people approximately at this point in time voted for Joe Biden. 70 million approximately voted for Donald Trump. We don't know the reasons behind there. It's a very different context. So we continue to talk about mandates, but elections are in a mass electorate with secret voting. It's very difficult to sort them out. And so one of the things that I always, enjoy in the sense of it's great sport is when journalists start speaking about mandates, and these elections didn't contain it. What's the mandate for this election? You can interpret it in any number of ways. Biden won the popular vote. Yep, he won popular vote by a decent margin. Wins a college probably by a decent margin. Does that mean he's wildly popular? I suspect his approval ratings will start out the gate around 50%. Would be a guess, a little higher than Trump's, but not dramatically so. And the Republican Party is likely to control the Senate. We should talk a little bit about the Senate elections. We should talk about the House elections, because the so-called blue wave did not appear. The Democrats have lost seats in the House of Representatives. They were counting on having seats. They lost them. And in the Senate also, I think a lot of people were assuming it'd move over, and it didn't. Aha! My co-conspirator is back.
Apologies.
Hey, actually, I think it was going better without you, so you can leave.
Any news?
And no.
Nothing happened this week?
No, nothing happened. And so I've been, carrying the water for both of us, my friend. So we've talked a little bit about the results. We've talked a little bit about the fact that elections are, in these days and age, don't offer mandates really because of private secret voting and mass electorates. Update a little bit on the polls. Talked about different kinds of transitions. And speaking of transitions, why don't we transition to your thinkings about the election and where things stand and
Sure. I think a couple of points. I think that President Trump's performance was surprising in terms, given what the polling showed. I think that said, the margin that it looks as though Biden will win by puts him in company. He will have polled more higher than Truman in 48, Kennedy in 60, Nixon in 68, about the same as Carter in 76, about the same as Reagan in 80, about the same as Bush in 88, higher than Clinton in 92, higher than Clinton in 96, higher than Bush in 2000, about the same as Bush in 2004, and about the same as he and Obama polled against Romney in 12, and higher than Trump. So this is a popular vote percentage win that's fully within the mainstream of American presidential elections since World War II. What he can do with that is a fabulous question, because while there were devoted counter votes in all those years, they weren't quite as well organized, and they weren't quite as driven by this notion that perhaps the election itself and the entire enterprise was somehow illegitimate. And so that's where the incumbent president becomes even more relevant, because his body language, his acceptance of the results matters. And right now he's not. And so it could very well be that it becomes even more difficult to govern than it is to govern anyway in the coming year or so. One thing I think that ameliorates that, and this is not a partisan point, is that Biden has a case study, a real issue which he can address, which is the pandemic. And can he use the levers of government to get the pandemic under control, try to recover from some of the economic and cultural damage, and be able to say that he delivered? That is, his message of unity, his message of government can work, we can compromise, we can respect science. In fact, all the stuff we've heard. He has a chance to manifest that. And I think, I have no data for this, but I think there are a lot of Republican mayors and governors who are probably eager to have a more forward-leaning pandemic response, and they can blame Washington while reaping the benefits, for instance, of wearing masks and doing contact tracing and the things that the incumbent president, has been reluctant to do, or at least uneven in his response. So it could be that in 6-8 months, Biden will be able to say, I have made the public sector work again. And that, I think, might help him as he moves on to other challenges.
No, that's absolutely right. And of course, part of what will transpire is affecting that is going to play out in Georgia come January 5th, I think, are the two runoffs. Obviously, the Democrats have some chance of getting the majority of the Senate. I think it's probably not very likely, but that's one key piece of the puzzle that will shape how things go forward. What's your best guesses about Georgia, John?
Oh, the Senate?
Yes.
Given the way this election was, I bet it's split. I mean, no data on that, but it's a knife's edge country. And my argument forever has been that it almost always is. We're always narrowly split. We're always closely divided. And so having Georgia, which is an interesting state in that it's changing rapidly, but not as rapidly as, say, Texas and California, ending up with a Democratic senator and a Republican senator would be fully in keeping with where the country seems to be.
Yeah, it'll be an interesting set of races, because part of the theme is going to be, we want divided government to check the excesses of the left. And that's going to be a theme. And I think it'll resonate in Georgia. I would be surprised if the Democrats take both seats. I think it's more likely the Republicans take both seats than the Democrats, but I agree there's probably a good chance it'll split. We'll have to see how that all that plays out. But it is continued evidence about how close things are. So what are the other, we want to talk about, really, we can continue to talk about the past or whatever, but how do you think Biden's particularly well positioned to navigate the Senate, especially given his relationship with many of the people, including McConnell, whereas Obama, by contrast, did not have a particularly good relationship with Congress. Is Biden, and also your thoughts about Pelosi and all of this as well.
Yeah, look, we know what we're getting, right? The country knows what it's getting. Joe Biden, there's nothing secret here. He was a senator for 36 years. He was vice president for 8. He's a creature of a deal-making Washington. that has made a lot less deals in recent years. I remember a senator telling me a story, excuse me, about when Senator-elect Obama showed up in Washington. Obama they'd be in an orientation meeting, and this was December '04. And Obama would be getting so many phone messages to go out and do national things that it annoyed all the other senators who were just trying to figure out where the bathroom was. And so he was already in a separate category, a different kind of thing. And so Joe Biden's not that, right? He and Mitch McConnell have served together since McConnell arrived in the Senate. I'm not saying that we're about to see a kind of Great Society, Lyndon Johnson era of golden cooperation, but you only need a couple of things. You only need, if you can control a pandemic, if you can get a infrastructure bill, presumably, if you can begin to get foreign affairs in a little more coherent shape. And then the big economic question, where do the tax rates go? Because I think there are a lot of people who voted for President Trump who were voting for an economic policy and a regulatory policy that would be more in keeping traditionally with where Republicans are than where Democrats are. And so that's a hugely important question. And, you know, it's been reported, McConnell used to say in the Obama years that you knew it was serious when Biden would get on the phone. You know, that's when the deals could be made. And you don't have to make a lot of them. I don't mean to lower expectations, but you only need a couple of things. And, you know, I know we've been asked a lot, have we ever been this divided? You know, it's pretty fundamental. We've been divided, patriot versus Tory, North versus South, industrial versus agrarian, isolationist versus interventionist, Jim Crow versus civil rights. We've been to, and now it's red versus blue. There are deep questions of culture and identity that are divisive. If you could invent somebody, however, to try to make things a little calmer, it would be somebody who looked a lot like Biden. He's just characteristically, temperamentally, he's not a divisive guy. He's just not. And that, to go to your Pelosi question, that is gonna make the left of his party pretty skeptical, right? I mean, they're gonna be looking for him to be an accommodationist. And what he sees as compromise, they will see as capitulation. And the far right will see as communism. So it's the three C's. God help Joe Biden here. I mean, he really is like the dog that caught the car. What are you going to do with it now? And so that's the tension. FDR faced that a little bit. FDR had bigger majorities. Johnson was always worried about his right flank and where conservatives were. If you want a little example of how the country bounces from here to there, my favorite one is in July of 1964, President Johnson signs the Civil Rights Act. In August, so 4, 5, 6 weeks later, he refuses to seat Fannie Lou Hamer and the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party delegation at the Atlantic City Democratic National Convention because he was afraid of handing too many states over to Goldwater. So here you have him finishing the work of Lincoln on one side, and then in August, he's really reverting to a kind of what the white Democratic Party was in those days. And it was in 6 weeks, and he was the same guy. So I think perspective, I would say this, perspective, proportion, you know, an understanding of the human forces here is going to be really vital to our seeing our public challenges whole, as opposed to seeing them as these perpetual firefights.
So it raises an issue when you talk about compromise, for example. I think this comment was made to me 4 years ago by a former member of Congress on the Republican side, Ben Weber from Minnesota, that somehow the concept of compromise itself had gotten changed, that everybody was looking for common ground, and they could find those areas of common ground and then have pass legislation, sign legislation along that line. But that's not what compromise is. Compromise is when you give up something that you care deeply about and you agree to that in exchange for something from the other side that they care about. And that's hard. And that, and that's where this term capitulation that the left will certainly use against Biden if he does compromise in this sense, it's really the premise of the American political system. I mean, it was premised on the idea that you are going to compromise in this harder way, because finding common ground is great and we need to do that, but that's not what compromise is. It's got to be where you give in something that you really care about. And so Ronald Reagan, classic example, when he made the deal with Tip O'Neill, he gave in on some tax rates that he cared deeply about, but he got back some things that the Democrats cared deeply about in regards to cutting back the size of the federal government. That's the way this system works. And it is one thing that I will say, and I defer to you here, John, but Biden gets that difference. He understands what compromise in the Madisonian sense is all about. And that in ways, the polarized political system has encouraged people to keep their ideological purity where they find common ground. That's all well and good, but that's not how the system works. And I will say that one of the things about the outcomes of this particular set of elections is going to force that kind of compromise. Mitch McConnell's going to have to give up some stuff, and Biden's going to have to give up some stuff, and Pelosi's going to have to give up some stuff. And I think you could interpret and underline the word could, that that's kind of what the country wants. Certainly the stock market has liked it. It's going crazy today apparently, but last week it was up as soon as they realized as of Wednesday morning that it was going to be a Democratic president, a Republican Senate. They couldn't ask for more because it was a sense of stability, that the blue wave didn't take place, that the progressives were not going to just move the country too far to the left. Because one of the lessons I do think comes from this election, it's partly due to the polls being off, is that this country is still very much, they like divided government.
Absolutely. And divided government reassures markets and reassures a lot of people and drives a lot of other people crazy. And that's America, right? We don't make rapid changes in this country, largely because of the nature of the Constitution itself. It was founded with this, it was framed with this sense and expectation that we were sinful and fallen and frail and fallible. And they made it very hard to get anything done rapidly because they assumed that most of what we tried to do rapidly would be wrong. And that's incredibly frustrating if you're a big climate change person, if you're someone who's very devoted to the cause of racial justice, to big legislative change in healthcare and in the economy. That's incredibly frustrating. And I understand that. And that's going to shape the argument that we're all going to be experiencing over the next few years.
So we've answered a number of the questions that we've gotten prior, and not nearly as many as we'd like. But one of the things people are going to want to talk about and think about is, what does Trump do post-presidency, and how does that affect both the Republican Party and what his own political aspirations are? I mean, that's a huge question that takes a lot of time, but what's going to happen to the Trump brand is another way to think about it.
If I knew that, I would be playing the market instead of talking to Geer right now. He's not going anywhere. He's going to be a force, I think, in our politics. The question is, to what extent, what is the scope of the field? What is the size of the field over which he exerts influence? And, populists in America don't tend to wear particularly well. That's just a historical reality. It's hard to maintain the passion, the anger, the emotion that drives big populist figures. Trump has been president for 4 years. He got 70 million people to say that the experience of the last 4 years was in fact what they wanted, at least either as a direct repetition or continuation, or it was preferred to the more caricatured view of the alternative. And so that's a big number. One of the great questions is what percentage of those folks are going to share his apparent view that the election is not legitimate in spite of all evidence so far. So that's an interesting one. You know, is he an opposition leader with a big Republican Party wide following? Or does he become an opposition leader for a smaller subset of that? And a lot of the shape of governance is going to hinge on precisely that question.
Yeah. And I think in general, we've talked about this in our class, is that, you know, let's assume that it's a pretty safe assumption at this point that Biden is in fact sworn in as president on January 20th, and Harris is sworn in as vice president. That basically this outcome generates battles within both parties between what we've called activists and purists. And usually that battle is much stronger in the party that loses, because there's going to be a whole bunch of, let's say, we'll call them Howard Baker Republicans, Lamar Alexander Republicans, since we obviously want to give a shout out to a Vanderbilt alum, that, you know, that they'd like to take the party back to be where it was. And there's going to be, and Trump, of course, is probably not going to favor that, especially if he harbors desires to run in 2024, or he's trying to set the table for one of his children. All those things are possible. That battle is going to be really pitched. I suspect that usually once you win, the battle between the pragmatists and the purists die down. It would die down in the Democratic Party, but it's not clear to me that's going to happen. That is that the AOC wing, the Bernie Sanders wing, whatever label you want, you know, have high expectations of what can take place. Now, maybe those will be tempered a little bit by a Republican Senate, but I'm not so sure. And so this is a battle. The divisions that occur across the country isn't just between Democrat and Republican. It's very strongly embedded within both parties as well. And that's the nature of politics. We're, you know, with a country of more than, 320 million people, there's going to be a huge numbers of disagreements, and they're all boiled down to two parties, which means that they're covering, a huge number of differences here. What's going to happen to the Republican Party? The Democratic Party will be in better position comparatively because they control the presidency, but there's still going to be the divisions. Do you see a scenario where it's not so much about Trump, but does the loss by Trump? Because the thing that the Republicans have to worry about isn't that it was a narrow election in 5 or 6 different states, is that, and we've said this before, I'm sure, maybe even on this webinar, but we've said it before, is that, the Republicans haven't won a majority of the popular vote over the last 30 years, except for once. I mean, that's got to be a source of real concern for the long-term, health of the party. And if states like Georgia now are becoming Democratic, Arizona becoming Democratic, that's, they're going to be putting themselves potentially in a serious, position. Now, they probably strengthened their hand in Florida. I think that's turning a little red, so that certainly helps. But
yeah, I think you're right. 1988 and 2004 are the last 2 times that Republicans won above 50% of the popular vote. And that's, if I were a Republican operative, that would be a really troubling number. And that's not really a partisan point. It's just the job of a political party is to achieve enough electoral success that you can put into action the policy objectives that your party believes in. It's kind of 101, right? That's party politics 101. That's why you have a party, is to do that. And it's become increasingly difficult to sell that entire agenda. Now, to me, that's what's interesting here is, and I don't want to commit the sin of middle roadism here. I mean, sometimes the middle path is the right path, sometimes it's not. But as a mathematical matter, what we see again and again in terms of the data is that the country tends to vote just more, there's few more folks voting for the Democratic line, but there's a significant pull, an almost equal pull, but not quite, on the Republican side. So we're not headed, it seems to me, to an FDR Truman 20 years. Right? Usually at this point in our world, people talk about a major realignment. There's barely a line at this point. And so I think we're just in an era of push and pull. And I know that feels incommensurate with a lot of feelings that people have on both sides of the aisle. People can't see how can they think that, right? How can anyone vote that way? And I've heard that from both camps, as I'm sure John has in recent days. But I'd submit that America's at her best not when we say, how could they, but when we try to understand why they could. And I think that's a hugely important task of citizenship ahead of us.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. We've been getting a few questions, Professor Meacham, about the recent news stories about a little bit of your prose making its way into the president's speech. Address that a little bit, not from the partisan implications, but share a little bit of insight into the president-elect's thinking and where he stands as he thinks about the tasks before him, because it strikes me that, holding aside, one's partisanship, that there's a huge number of crises that the country's currently facing. He has got, one heck of a government to try to run. What's your thinking there?
My sense is he's as moderate a guy as ever drew breath. In terms of temperament, he understands everything we're saying, I think he would have agreed with. In terms of, you can't dismiss 70 million people, right? You can't push them off. You have to understand where they're coming from and why. Doesn't mean you're going to win them over. Doesn't mean you're going to placate, but you have to understand it, because in a democracy, you can't be for democracy when you win and against it when you lose, right? That's not the way it works. It's like free speech. I can't be for the First Amendment when I'm speaking and against it when you're speaking. Although I do try to do that with Dean Geer. Well, no. So he's a very stable, grounded man. And I'm not saying anything that's particularly inside. I mean, I think it's the evidence of many, many years in public life. He's had his ups and downs, like all of us. There is this interesting thing in which presidential politics do tend to be a mirror of who we are as much as a maker. And in 2016, Trump was a mirror of a country that was uninterested in traditional politics. And I think that Biden's victory here suggests that it's a mirror of a country that is going through tragedy, is going through anxiety, needs some resilience, needs a sense that, we can get through this. And he just wants, again, he says this all the time and has for years, he wants us to listen a little bit more and shout a little bit less.
Yeah,
and that's genuine. That's genuine to him. That's not a focus group thing,
Right.
That's not. That's legitimate. It may not be commensurate. It may not lead to presidential greatness. I don't know, but it's who he is.
Yeah, and I think that's I take comfort from the fact that just willing to listen to the other side, pay attention to the evidence, I mean, that's the thing that gets me most worried about this, as I've said in other quarters and on this webinar as well, is that we have to stick to the evidence. I mean, it bothers me that there's something wrong with our ability to communicate in regards to, let's just take wearing masks and social distancing. 100,000 Americans would be alive today if we practiced that from the beginning. And it's just true. And people can say that's partisan. It's not partisan, it's science. And from time to time, science is not designed to be partisan. It's designed to tell the facts. Sometimes the results are partisan, just like, a lot of times the Republicans have the right argument. The Democrats don't like to admit that either. So it's both sides that are equally guilty of that. And if Biden's prepared to listen, and I don't have any reasons, there's a bunch of questions on this. And, obviously there's an historic vice president that's about to take the oath of office. She is going to be, I'm sure, a big presence in that White House because he was when Obama was president. So I would expect him to keep the same kind of thing. What role do you think Harris is going to be able to play in a Biden presidency, and what is the just generally your thoughts about that, because I think that's going to be fascinating.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. That's a ticket that looks like America. 77-year-old white guy and a woman not radical. that's what people think, from a different demographic part of the country, but brought together by national election. And successful vice presidents are the ones who do what the president, accept the role that they negotiate at the front end. George H.W. Bush was a successful vice president. Walter Mondale was. Joe Biden was. Al Gore was. Dick Cheney was, in terms of what the administration wanted. The ones who are unhappy in that role, Lyndon Johnson under Kennedy, I guess to go into Spiro Agnew, I guess leads us into a different place altogether. But vice presidents who aren't particularly happy are those who don't have a clear working relationship with the president. And I think that Biden will understand the political value and the benefit to governance of having a former state attorney general, United States senator, as engaged as possible. It's a little trickier, Reagan and Bush. Bush was on the ticket because he was more moderate than Reagan, and Bush spent most of those 8 years trying to get more conservative. So that's a different thing. Gore, I think, had a lot of big policy briefs, policy portfolio. I suspect Harris will too. And I think that, the visual vernacular matters. The iconography of power matters. And having a woman at the highest levels, nearly the highest levels, is going to matter.
So I'm just trying to look at a few more questions here. So one question is, and this is an inevitable question, there's fears that Trump will not leave office. Well, actually, it doesn't have much say over that. On January 20th, the power will transition to Biden. That's not a worry. And in fact, some of the apparatus were put into place, and I'm sure Trump would not have approved it, but when did Secret Service protection started to beef up already? It was way before Biden became president-elect. The Secret Service simply took it as their responsibility to protect what they thought was going to be the next president of the United States. And so there is a machinery of government that will make sure this kind of a transition takes place. And I also think that, having 74 days, or maybe it's now a little less than 74 days till January 20th, it also does give President Trump a chance to come to grips with this. It's not like he's, in the British case, the prime minister's out the next day, or pretty much so. So there's a transition for him as well, I suppose, and that could help.
Yeah, for what it's just a dork historical point. So Secret Service protection for major presidential candidates began in 1968 after the assassination of Robert Kennedy. President Johnson stepped in. And so those numbers went up. The levels of protection went up late last week.
Yeah. So we've got a couple of questions because we've been bantering back and forth on this. Is that, probably everybody on this call, just like you and I, think that we need to find ways to get evidence to back into the conversations that don't have ideology drive the decision making, but rather have some combination of evidence and principle, which I do draw that distinction. While that might be a worthy goal, how does that become more of a reality?
It depends on whether evidence-based decision-making can also be framed and realized as being politically beneficial to the people making that policy and having to vote on that policy. We have to incentivize problem solving as opposed to partisan warfare. And that's really hard. And again, you just have to pick a couple. That's what history tells us. But you got to make it easier for people to take a stand and have to sell something to their state, their district, when those people think they don't want to buy. And so if there is a big push on pandemic, on the economy, on climate, the task of the administration, the task of great political leadership in a popular government is making it as much as possible a political winner take all. I'm sorry, not that sounds the opposite. That everybody has a win. You got to give people that, because people who have to go back and explain a defeat are in a position of weakness. You want to be able to go back and say, I got you this many green jobs or whatever it is.
Yeah, it's the other, I think, once a vaccine comes out, of course, part of the reason the market's going crazy is apparently Pfizer is that much closer to having a vaccine for COVID-19. And of course, a big problem is that a lot of people may not want to take that vaccine. And so there's going to be a real issue of leadership of trying to get more and more people doing it. But if in fact, science broadly, or pharmaceutical industry more particularly, can in fact provide a solution that shows that science can be at work, I think there's an opportunity to maybe provide more evidence-based kinds of conversations. I also think that universities need to be part of these conversations, that the Aspen group and TED Talks are all fine, but to some degree, universities have abdicated their responsibility on this front. And they partly abdicated because universities most faculty tend to be on the left side of the spectrum, and that has its own implications in ways that are pretty serious. But if you really believe in evidence-based conversation, you're going to find yourself on the right and the left a little bit. And the universities can be platforms. We can be platforms in ways where conversations just like this can take place. But it's also true that we have to educate our students in ways that they care about data, they care about evidence. They realize they need to develop what we might call these habits of the mind, which are being able to think critically, think through logic, value evidence and value array of evidence. Sometimes it's just the anecdote that you happen to come across somebody that opens up a whole, window into America. I mean, my brother-in-law, who is a Trump supporter, I was asking about it, not in a judgmental way in any way, shape, or form. He says, I'm an airline pilot. He says, without Trump's bailout of the airlines, I'd be unemployed. And that was pretty powerful. He didn't say it in any way, but that's the type of thing. And universities need to be more part of that to make sure that we do it. And I will say that I give huge marks to people like Zeppos and Wente and now Diermeyer for advancing conversations that aren't driven just by ideology. And my friend John here has been a huge part of many of those conversations, and universities need to step that up even more, in my opinion. And a place like Vanderbilt's particularly well situated, I would say.
I couldn't agree more. I think that one of the things we've learned anew in the last 4 or 5 years is that it's really easy to generate heat. It's much harder to shed light. And our dispositions of heart, but also our dispositions of mind matter enormously. And the more you know about a particular issue, often the more complicated it gets, but it's also empowering, right? Because knowledge is power. You know, it may not lead us to a solution. It may not lead us to the kingdom of heaven on earth, but it can in fact be part of that great Enlightenment tradition that knowledge is essential, and that critical thinking and reason have to take primacy of place against mindless partisanship and perpetual political passion.
Yeah, I think, I've been struck by, there's too much leaping to assumptions about what people's intentions are. I always tell my colleagues I said, when something goes wrong, don't assume that I have some ill intent. I'm just incompetent. I just make a mistake. I mean, there's no intent behind it. Right. And I think that's where, we've got to realize that Americans, regardless of whatever stripe their intent, we hope, and I think it's a fair assumption, is that they are patriots, and we just need to make sure that that we understand that basis, that they really do want, to use Trump's term, they want to make America great again, whether you're on the left or the right. Very different strategies by which to do this. But, the care, I think anybody who questions these results of this election, it bothers me in part because the care with which was taken to count all these votes. Josh Clinton, which I mentioned at the outset when John was unavailable for a few minutes, Josh told me this morning a story where Pennsylvania's Attorney General intentionally separated out any vote that came after Election Day in case there was a legal challenge, that those could then be separated and taken away from the vote. It's a very small number. It's not going to affect any outcome. But this particular secretary took the effort to make sure that every county did that. So if there was a legal challenge, do it. Now, somebody could have tried to muck around with it and just thrown them all in the mix, but people are taking their responsibilities very seriously. The people who are counting votes were taking it seriously. The election desks, we had a question in class that whether one of the students says, well, is Fox going to be able to call the election in a fair way, which is a question that's symbolic of the problems with our politics. The people at the Fox election desk are professionals. They know what they're doing. And in fact, they controversially called Arizona before the left, leaning organizations like MSNBC did. Why? Because they believed in that. And these are the things that we need to focus on, is that there are these patriots out there. And this is been a tough election in so many different ways. But it is also a chance to celebrate that turnout, celebrate the fact we're going to have a peaceful transition of power. It won't necessarily be smooth, but I think it'll be peaceful. And that's really important.
Well, I want to thank everybody for sticking with us all for three or four of these. It's been a great honor to be with your fellow future alumni. We have a lot of them in class. It's been terrific. And you've got an alma mater that, except for the dean of the college, we're very pleased by its quality, and its grace and commitment to truth, not partisanship. So thank y'all.
Yeah, it's the little things that really make you stand back. I mean, students who, are trying to work through people having different views, something they hadn't come to grips with. That's why they're here. Or little things I was saying to John over the weekend, or maybe it was Friday, that in my conversation with Josh Clinton, as you might imagine, all the news organizations want to be the first one to call the election. And Josh convinced the people at NBC that say, let's not try to beat Fox on this. Let Fox call it before us, because it'll help legitimize the outcome. We know what's going to happen. We know Biden's going to win. We have to wait for the votes to be counted so it's legitimate. But we don't need to rush into this. And, in some sense, Josh is taking away from the glitz that could be calling it first. But that was his view, and he was right about that. I think it was CNN who actually broke it first, so that NBC was not part of it. But those little things, because people care about the outcome, they care about the process. These are really important things. Let's have one or two more questions, and then we'll let people go. So what is, I'm trying to see, if you're advising Biden, which you've obviously talked to him a lot, he'll be talking about the pandemic. What are the themes that you think he needs to stress when he takes office? What does his inaugural take look like? It may be that, in fact, given what we know, you may have some hand in that.
You
are
know,
we there yet? Where you know, is it the next 70 days going to shape that as well? Obviously, to some degree, it has to.
yeah, I think it's unity. I think it's unity and reason, right? It's let's get to work here. I'm guessing, I don't know, but I think if somebody asked me, it would be, we've come through a period in America where we have led with our divisions instead of what pulls us together. And so can't we at least have a different default position, right? It's not going to be perennial, but maybe we could start a day in terms of, you know what, let's see what we can get done, as opposed to starting the day with, let's see how we can score points.
And I do think that I'm hoping that the news organizations stop the outrage of the day kind of reporting. I'm not sure it's very easy to do that, but you know, we'll see how it plays out. Well, I think on that note, as Professor Meacham indicated, you know, we're just consistently impressed with the students. They really do suggest that the future is going to be just fine. And the you know, Vanderbilt's training the next generation of leaders, but lots of other colleges all across the country are doing the same, you know, the same thing. And I think it's really a testament to these students and how much they continue to follow the rules. These protocols are not designed for the lifestyles of 18 to 22-year-olds. They really do fit Meacham's and my lifestyle. Social distancing is just fine.
This is great. This is great. This is great. No, I think it's, you know, if you care about the stuff that John and I care about, for all of our joking, it's a rich and yeasty and fascinating time to be confronting these issues and having these conversations. You know, this is not Romney versus Obama, right? I mean, this is a big moment where we're going to see whether we have the collective will to address a very particular question. All right, it's not theoretical. We need to control this virus, and so apparently America just barely, but has voted to see if a different team can do differently, and maybe that will apply to other issues as well.
Yeah, no, that's right. And you know, and it's you know, it's just so important to think about the future, not relitigate the past. Yeah. And it'll be really interesting to see how it plays.
We love the past. We love litigating it. So don't be too. See, that's a classic political science thing to say, right? Oh, we have to use data. History, guys, do the history.
Yeah, do both.
Fair enough.
Okay. Well, on that note, we're going to let people take their leave. It's exactly noon. Thank you again. And John Meacham, thank you for all that you've done. Okay.
All right. See y'all. See you in the class tomorrow.
Yep. Bye-bye.